tell you something which might be of interest. It's kind of a glimpse into the lives of people who the otherwise might not see. King David started out life way behind the 8 ball. And here's how it happened. We just had the holiday of Shavuos, we read the book of Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite woman, marries a Jewish guy, the guy dies, comes back with her mother-in-law to Israel, and her mother-in-law, Naomi, wants to find a place for her daughter-in-law. And there's a relative named Boaz, and Naomi, there's certain negotiations, and idea is that Boaz, because he's a relative, has some responsibility to make sure that Ruth is settled. And he's prepared even to marry her, and she's prepared to go with him. But there's another relative who's closer to the dead husband. So Boaz interviewed this guy and said, listen, something has to be done for Ruth, and you're the closest relative, and I'm the one after you. You make up your mind. You want to go ahead and marry her, then fine, you'll take care of her. If not, I'll take care of her. And the relative says, I can't do it, lest I destroy what I pass down to future generations. My estate, you could call it. Lest I destroy my estate. You want to go ahead and do it? Do it. And Boaz does it. Now what's going on? What's going on is this. When the Jewish people left Egypt, their path took them next to the nations of Moab and Ammon. Moab and Ammon come from our relatives. They really come from children of Lot, and Lot was Abraham's nephew. So they're close to us. We might have expected some help from them, some recognition. Nothing. Got absolutely nothing. They just ignored us. There we are in the desert. Of course, God is sustaining us, but they don't offer any recognition or any help. So the Torah says, because of that, there's going to be a penalty for them in terms of relationship with us. Now, you have to get it right. Many people have this wrong. Anyone can convert to become Jewish. Anyone. There's no limit whatsoever. Even an Amalekite can convert to become Jewish. But after they become Jewish, there may be certain restrictions on them. And on Ammon and Moab, the restriction is that they cannot marry into born Jews ever. No matter how many generations it is, they can't marry into Jews who have lineage back to Jacob. Now, that's for sure true about Moabite men. But it's not for sure true about Moabite women. There was some discussion of this, some controversy about this. Some felt the prohibition only applies to men. Some felt the prohibition applies to women as well. That closer relative who refused to marry Ruth said, I'm afraid. You couldn't say that he was sure what the law was. I'm afraid. It's an unsettled issue. And therefore, I'm not going to take the chance of marrying her because her descendants, every one of them, is going to have this penalty that they'll never be able to marry a born Jew. Boaz says, I'm not in doubt. I know what the law is. The law is the men and not the women. The women are perfectly permissible. So he marries. And by the way, Boaz is right. Boaz is right. That's where the law is ultimately codified.
Doesn't that make less sense? Because the women are what carry on the Jewish bloodline. So if a Jewish man marries a Moabite woman, isn't that the bloodline ending? So
Good
shouldn't it be the other way around?
I think you're right. But here it's based on the cause of the restriction. The cause of the restriction is that they did not show you the kind of recognition and help that would have been expected of a friend. That kind of public recognition and help is usually done by men, not by women.
You're saying the Moabite men didn't help enough.
That's right.
So they're being
and in other words, the responsibility to help is more essentially on the men than the women, and therefore they pay the bigger penalty. The question is whether the women's participation also qualifies for some level of penalty. That was a discussion, roughly. So Boaz says, I know I'm right, and I'm marrying her. And he does. Good. They have a child. That child is a child. And then the child after that is David. David's father is Yishai. Yishai is Ruth's grandchild. He gets married and he has a family. After he has 6 sons, suddenly Yishai becomes doubtful. My grandmother is Ruth. Boaz married her. Was it right? Did he have any right to marry her? Maybe the Moabite women are forbidden. If the Moabite women are forbidden and I'm a grandson of a Moabite woman, I'm forbidden also. What about my wife? What about my 6 children? Now, he says, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'm in doubt. Other people aren't in doubt.
He was also from those descendants?
Who?
Yishai.
He's Ruth's grandson. He's Ruth's grandson. So he says, the fact that I'm in doubt, I can't impose that on anybody else. I can't force anybody else to abide by my doubt. Therefore, I have no right to publicize it. Because I publicize it, that people are going to associate that with my children. They have no right to pay a penalty. I can't impose my doubt on them. On the other hand, he says, I can't continue living with my wife, because if I'm if I'm a descendant of, I can't do that. So he tells his wife, listen, we have to separate, but we can't divorce, and we can't, because that's going to create an investigation. So we'll live together in the same house, and we'll continue to function as if we were a family, but I can't have relations with you. Okay, but it's not permissible for a man, if at all possible, to be in a condition where there's no one with whom he can have relations. So what he did was this. He took a non-Jewish, well, really strictly as a slave woman, and he freed her on condition. And he said, look, I don't know what my status is. If I'm a full-fledged Jew and I can marry anybody I like, I'm freeing you, and you become a full-fledged Jewess, and we will live together as man and wife. If I'm not allowed to marry a Jew, then you remain a slave, a non-Jewish slave, and then I can live with you because of my status. It permits me to live with a non-Jewish slave. And he made that condition, and he started living with her, that's all. In private, nobody knew. Nobody knew. So here he is, 6 sons, not having relations with his wife, and having secretly relations with, he told this to his wife, secretly having relations with this non-Jewish slave woman with the conditional freedom. That's how the situation was set. Now comes a part in the story which is very mysterious, and it's not the only story with this mysterious element. His wife knew she had to bear him another son. She knew that. I don't know how she knew that. According to one of the commentators, it had to be something like Ruach HaKodesh, Holy Spirit. Otherwise, she could never have acted on it. She knew this had to happen. She couldn't explain it to her husband. She had the Spirit, not he. So she tells the servant woman, one night, I'm going to switch places with you. One night, I'm going to switch places with you. And she does. She gets pregnant. Now look at this from Yishai's point of view. He's not living with his wife, and she gets pregnant. How does that happen? It must be that she committed adultery. She's silent. It must be that she committed adultery. Fine. Another son is born. That son has to be what we call a mamzer. That's David. That's David. He's the 7th son. He was born under conditions where his father is convinced that he's a mamzer. But he can't tell anybody. He can't tell anybody. Because if he tells somebody, the whole tale is going to unravel, and his 6 prior sons are then going to be under suspicion, and he can't do that to them. But he can't treat David equally. He can't do it. So David is clearly discriminated against and becomes an outcast. And he says in Psalms, David says, when anything was stolen in my village, they blamed that on me. When anything was lost or was broken in the village, they blamed it on me. He grew up with the atmosphere that he was a criminal. Now, God says to Saul the prophet, let's try that again, to Samuel the prophet, I want you to go to Yishai's house. One of Yishai's sons is going to be king. Okay? Yishai was a big man. He was a great man. So, Samuel the prophet comes to Yishai's house and says to Yishai, gather in all your sons. And Yishai does. All 6 of them. Because only 6 are his sons. The 7th one is a result of adultery. Gathers in all 6. And then Samuel the prophet goes down the list. Which one should be king? And Samuel says, wow, this one's looks like a good candidate. Has all qualifications. God says to Samuel, you don't understand anything. I'm disgusted by him, God says. He says, Ha'adam yira le'inayim, Hashem yira le'levav. Man sees with the eyes, God sees into the heart. No man can see into the heart of another person, including a prophet like Samuel, who's compared in one verse to Moses and Aaron. So, they go down through all 6, and God rejects all 6. So Samuel says to Yishai, I don't get it. God sent me here. He told me that one of your sons is going to be king. I've gone through all 6. God said no to all 6. Don't you have any more sons? Yishai says, no, I don't have any more sons. And Samuel says, not possible. You must have another son. So, in confusion, in shock, Yishai calls in David. And Samuel says, he's the one. Yishai knows this can't be right. It can't be right. He knows what the situation is. What can he do? God's prophet says so. And the family knows. Nobody else knows, but the family knows. He's dedicated. They can't wrap their minds around it. They can't get to it. To the extent that when David comes to fight Goliath, 2 of his elder brothers are in the army, and they see him coming up, and they say, what are you doing here? You're a bum. Go back with the sheep. You came here to see the excitement of war? This is a man whom God's prophet designated to be king, and they're treating him like a criminal. They can't grasp it. They can't get their minds around it. Of course, David kills Goliath, and people know that story, and they think, but they misunderstand, because prior to that, David was a shepherd, and prior to that, he had single-handedly killed a lion and a bear. So he knew he could do it. He wasn't in any doubt. He wasn't in any danger. And that's why he presented himself. And this Mishlob is filled with armor, and King David goes with no armor, just with a slingshot. He has no doubts. God enabled him to overcome a lion and a bear. They're much stronger than human beings, even a monster like Goliath. After that, so David now gains some prominence. That's not the end of David's suffering. When David becomes king, his oldest son, Avshalom, leads a rebellion against him, a civil war. And they take over the capital. And they start chasing him. And David, with soldiers from the tribe of Judah, which is his tribe, who are loyal to him, run, and they cross the Jordan River. Now, on the other side of the Jordan River is desert. So David says, this is because of something else. I'm telling you now, I just want to show you how it goes. David, when he crosses the Jordan River, says, okay, here we'll make a stand, because to go further is just suicide. There's nothing on the other side. We'll take a stand, but only defensive. We won't attack, only defensive. And don't anyone lay hands on Avshalom.
On what?
Avshalom, his son, the one who's leading the attack. Well, the general says to himself, the king is not being practical here. You can't leave alive someone who led a rebellion and created a civil war. You can't do that. As long as he's alive, you're just waiting for the next war. You're just waiting for the next secession. So there's a battle. And of course, David's forces win. And Avshalom, who was a Nazirite and had long hair, was running away, and his hair got caught on a branch And the horse kept going, he's hanging by his hair from the branch, and the general comes over and kills him. And David goes into grief, screaming, Avshalom, my son,
So what
Avshalom.
was hanging from the branch?
In other words, Avshalom had long hair,
Yeah.
and as he was riding to get away, his long hair caught on a branch of a tree, and the horse kept going, and he ended up hanging by his hair from the tree. And along came the general and
Just want to cut my hair.
just killed him. Just killed him. That's all.
A quick question too.
Well, let me finish the description and what I want to get to. So, David had a lot of suffering. Anything that a human being could suffer, David had. So much so that in Psalms, David says, actually in Hallel, which we said yesterday, we'll say tomorrow, Ani amarti kol adam kozev. I said, all man does not live up to his promise, does not fulfill his potential. People, I felt it myself, great spiritual potential, but the circumstances were so cruel to me, so devastating to me. I never had an opportunity to grow and to develop. I said that man does not fulfill his potential. But later, David changed his mind. When he saw what he became, and we saw that every step in his development was necessary to become the kind of king that he had to become, he then rethought his history and said, no, I was given the opportunity to develop into what I have to develop. The king is understood in our literature, the king of the people, as the heart. The heart has to sense where there's damage, has to sense where there's strain, and take measures to correct it. The heart has to hold the whole of the people together, just like the human heart supplies oxygen and food to the whole body, and without that, the body cannot live. So the king, who's the heart of the Jewish people, also has to feel for the whole people and provide for the whole people. And for that purpose, I'm doing that very superficial, but for that purpose, seeing the lower end of life is not a bad thing. Seeing how people are disadvantaged and taken advantage of and who are discriminated against and who have to suffer, it's not a bad thing if you have to take responsibility for the whole people, not just the rich and successful people, but the whole people. And I think this becomes a lesson, if you keep it in front of your eyes. By the way, you can read about this. There's a book called The Book of Our Heritage, 3 volumes. Goes through the Jewish year, month by month. And it's, even day by day. And it shares sources on what's relevant to that day. If you look in the month of Sivan, in the holiday of Shavuos, it has this description of David's childhood upbringing that I just gave you. I think this becomes a kind of image or symbol for us because often enough in our own lives things happen that we don't understand. Things happen that look like they're destructive. They look like they cut off opportunities that we wish we had had. And we have to know that these things are not by accident, they're not by happenstance. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who takes into account the development of each one, of each individual, he is the one who's organizing the circumstances to make sure that each of us is able to do what we have to do. You have a question?
It was just sort of having to do with, like, David and his son, like, if there is a tyrant, like a leader or somebody like that, like a king, and you know that, if you don't kill them, that they're going to keep killing people, but it's not necessarily self-defense, is that tolerated?
Okay, I'll tell you what the general law is, but of course there could be many, many details which would switch it one way or the other. Suppose A sees that B is chasing C to kill C. A is not in danger. A has a responsibility to stop B. And the only way he can stop B is by killing him, he has to kill him.
I'm aware of that rule.
Okay, so...
But even if he's not chasing, if you just know, this person, they're not chasing him, but you just know they've done horrible, horrible things, and they're not necessarily on their way to do it, but you just know, that they will. As far as, like, are you able to keep a clear conscience, kill a tyrant,
yeah,
even without self-defense, and have a clear conscience?
Well, so I already subtracted self-defense. Self-defense isn't the issue, because when A sees B chasing C.
Okay.
It's not self-defense anymore.
Defense of anyone, just
Right.
as far as
So you're questioning how immediate it has to be.
Yeah.
That I don't know. That I don't know. The classical cases where he's running to kill him. Now you're asking, I know he made plans and everything, because there's always, we would say, the chance that he'll change his mind. Now you say, but we know realistically that he's not going to change his mind.
Classic.
He's done it so many
scenario
times, sure.
In like American movie culture these days, where there's a good guy and he wants to kill the bad guy, but therefore by killing the bad guy and not putting him through the legal system, then he loses himself of who he is. So he's like, now I'm a bad guy if I kill the bad guy.
Yeah.
Kind of scenario. So
I don't know how immediate it has to be. But let me tell you something. You raised this kind of question. Something that happened to me. It was a real incident. When I was teaching at Johns Hopkins in the 70s, I used to ride, in those days, a 10-speed bike was the cat's meow. That's the latest stuff. I was on a 10-speed bike, and it was like 3-4 miles from home. And I would ride the bike to Hopkins. Foolishly, I locked it in the parking lot of the cars, and someone cracked the lock and stole the bike. After that, when I got a new one, I took it up to the office, and locked it in my office. So I notified the police, A couple of months later, I get a call from the police. We think that we have recovered your bike. Would you come down and identify it? So I came down, and by golly, it was my bike. Thank you very much. And they said, now listen, we have to ask you, do you want to press charges? We found the guy who had it. It isn't that we found it abandoned. We found the guy who had it. Do you want to press charges against this fellow, who happened to be black? So I thought to myself, wow, this is tricky ground here. This is tricky ground. Whatever I say, whatever I do, can be criticized this way or that way. So that's what I tell you, this has never happened to me before. I have no experiences. What do you recommend? So the policeman, this could only happen in America. The policeman says to me, well, I see that you're a religious Jew. I saw an episode of Gunsmoke. Gunsmoke was a weekly Western movie show that was shown in the United States in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And on this episode, A and B are having a shootout, and B starts to run, and A is running after him, and there's a whole posse of people chasing A to try to stop him. And B goes around the corner, and A goes around the corner. By the time the posse gets there, B's dead. And A's standing there. And the people say, he's a killer, a murderer. There's nobody else around, and he did it. And there is a rabbi there. And the rabbi says, according to God's law, if you didn't see the murder, you can't prosecute him. You can't draw the conclusion without seeing
Two witnesses.
Okay, so imagine this non-Jewish policeman is telling me this because he saw it on Gunsmoke. So he says to me, and I guess since you're a religious Jew, since nobody saw him steal it, you shouldn't press charges. I said to him, thank you very much, I'm not going to press charges.
Well, it's different on property.
Sure, it's different. But look at this. That incident sticks out in my mind. He saw it. He developed a positive image towards Jews. He used it to advise me. I mean, the openness and the friendliness of it, to me, the acceptance of it was really
Well, now
unique.
You just went right into what has been my main gripe with being here. I don't know if you know my story, but I was born a Jew, raised Christian.
Oh.
And I found out that technically, if your mom's Jewish, you're 100% Jewish. I found this out a year and a half ago.
Oh, wow.
So now I'm moving here making Aliyah.
Oh, I see. Wow.
So being raised a Christian my whole life, that's who was always around me. And as much as I didn't like it and didn't want to go, they were kind people. And they knew we were Jewish. And they were very kind to us, very supportive. You're the chosen people. We admire you. How can we help? Jews for Jesus, this.
Yeah.
And I come here, and there's nothing but disdain spoken for Christians. I understand the history of Christians, the Crusades, and all this and this. But as far as what I've seen these days, Methodist Christians are the #1 financial supporters of Israel in the United States.
Yeah.
And they're nothing but kind to me, and things like this. And everyone here, they just, I don't hear a thank you. I don't hear but all I hear is, they're contributing money because they have ulterior motives because they want the Jews to be in Jerusalem in order for their Messiah to come.
That might be true of some of them, but certainly not true of all of them. I'll tell you, my father was born on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1899. I am really ancient. My father was born there, and he was loyal to the United States. And he said, I'll tell you why, because they gave us a chance. I don't want any more than that. I don't want any special help, special hands, special grants. Just give me a chance. Let me work, and let me earn an honest dollar, and let me pay taxes like everybody else. Just give me a fair chance. And Jews don't have that. In the rest of the world, certainly not in 1900. They didn't have that. They were coming to America from Russia and from Poland and from the whole of Eastern Europe, which was killing them. And the Western Europe turned against them, and with the Russians, with the Germans and the French, so half of whom collaborated with the Nazis. And just give me a chance. That's all. And he was very grateful for that. And I've seen the same thing as well. Whatever I've done, I had nothing. The fact that when we go back, my wife and I, sometimes we take trips. We rent a car, we go through rural New England and everything else. We don't look like everybody else. But people are always friendly, always open, always helpful, always considerate. And I heard an article now that the golden age for the Jews in America is over because of the Islamic unrest and anti-Semitism and all the rest. Well, I lived through 1973. 1973, there was a big war, Arab-Israeli war, Yom Kippur War. Mm-hmm. And because the United States sided...
You were here?
No, I was in America. Because the United States sided with Israel, the Arab countries cut down oil supplies to the United States. And there was gas rationing. You could only buy gas 3 days a week. If you had an odd number, it was Sundays, Tuesdays, and Fridays, and Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and even number, and Sundays, they were closed altogether. And the price of gasoline was gigantic. It was like $4 or $5 a gallon. It's 73. And that's when the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit was put in because they had to save gas, right? Now, American loves his automobile. It's my car. It's my freedom. I go. And now his freedom is being very substantially restricted, and it's hitting him in the pocketbook.
Blaming the Jews.
There was no anti-Semitism.
No?
No, it was shocking. One place in a very rural area, there was a bumper sticker, burn Jews, not oil. Okay. America's a big country.
Yeah.
I don't know, they had 180 million people at that time. There was no public outcry against Jews at all. I think that's amazing. There's a real respect, fair play, acceptance, often with honoring Jews for what they are, and I think we should definitely be grateful for that, and we should express our gratitude for that. I agree with that 100%.
Good, it's good to hear it.
And if other people don't say that, the Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was one of the greatest decisors of practical law in the 20th century, who came from Russia to the United States, described the United States as a country of kindness. Medina Shel Chesed, a country of kindness. And anyway, so back to where we started from, the idea that you have things that happen to you and you can't understand them, you can't grasp them, and you can't explain them. Jewish life is like that. And it certainly happened to King David. The other great example of this is Abraham, when God told him to sacrifice Isaac. Now, it's a gigantic story. I'm not going to do it tonight, but there's one crucial thing. God had told Abraham, Ki b'Yitzchak yikareh l'chazara. Isaac will be your continuation. Isaac is your future. When God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, Isaac had no children. So you have an absolute contradiction between two things that God told Abraham. It's an absolute contradiction. They cannot both be true. So much so that one commentator, it's only one as far as I know, but it's a Shlomo Kodesh, a major commentator, says that it was since it was such an absolute contradiction, Abraham would have been within his rights not to slaughter his son. Because he could say to God, you told me two things, they can't both come true. So, that doesn't give me any direction what to do. So I'm choosing this one. and he would have been within his rights to choose the other one. Others don't follow him, but it's definitely a contradiction. And you do slaughter his son, you're giving up on what he promised you. Now, how can you give up on what God promised you? The answer is, what you say is, ultimately, I don't really understand God. Yes, he interacts with me. Yes, there's certain things that he reveals to me. But ultimately, I don't understand him. There has to be some reason why this is right, and I don't have it. Not to take the radical step that some misled radical theologians want to take, that God is beyond comprehension and what he does can be irrational. It can be contradictory. It can be nonsensical. How can you reduce God to your... No, God set up this world in such a way that we should understand it. He's beyond comprehension, but he chose to make a world that we could understand. That's what he chose to do. So there has to be an explanation. And Abraham says, I don't know what it is. I have to follow anyway. My ignorance of the explanation isn't a good reason to say no. In the end, we see it was only a test. But he had to be willing to say, I'm going to carry it out in ignorance. Now that episode is in the prayer book. And some people say it every morning. One of the reasons they say it every morning is because this happens to people. It happens. Things happen that we can't explain. It happens to individuals. It happens to the nation, the Holocaust, others. We say, look, Abraham went through this 3,800 years ago. And the fact that Abraham lived through it, I'm telling you something very important, the fact that Abraham lived through it creates reality for us as well. The fact that he did it makes it possible for us to do it. The first one who does it on his own. Everyone else who does it by imitation. And that makes it much easier to do. Do you know the history of running the 4-minute mile? You know the first person was to run the 4-minute mile?
Was that the... I heard this.
It's a great British runner named Roger Bannister. Until he did it, there was this feeling that the human body isn't built to do a mile in 4 minutes. If you try to do a mile in under 4 minutes, you're going to die. You're going to die. Many people came close, but nobody cracked it. He cracked it within months. A number of other people had cracked it. It was a psychological barrier. He was the one who had the courage to do what people thought, couldn't be done. We too face. The point by telling you that is, once he did it, it was much easier for everybody else. Now we accept that principle. We've had it long before Roger Bannister, but we have that principle also. The first person who does something creates a new reality, and that new reality makes it possible for other people to do. There was a woman whom a king wanted to make her and her children worship an idol, and she said no, and she lost 7 sons, and then she died as well.
She refused to.
She refused, and then there was no end to the story. At any rate, so some people say, well, what is Abraham so great? He was willing to sacrifice Isaac, and it didn't happen. And she actually lost 7 sons. Answer, her strength to do that came from Abraham. His strength came from nowhere, because there was nobody before him that he could lean on. Once he did it, he brought that strength into the world. And this now becomes a general principle. The Chaim Volozhiner was a student of the Gaon of Vilna, had a yeshiva. And a problem came up in the learning, and he spent several days working on it and struggling with it. And he finally came up with a solution. And he explained it to the students, colleagues, and they went through it, and it was a satisfactory solution. Sometime later, he was on a trip, came to a Jewish inn. It was very common business in those days for Jews to run kosher inns. And he's sitting at dinner by himself, and the next table there are 2 Jews, and they're talking about Torah's topics, and his question comes up. So he thinks, wow, they're going to discuss my question. I wonder what they're going to say. So we discuss it for a few minutes, and then one of them suggests his answer.
His question was what?
I don't know. I didn't say. I don't know what the question was.
Oh, you just happen to have a question.
Yeah.
Okay.
So these 2, so to speak, ordinary Jews are discussing it casually, and they come up with the answer in a few minutes. He spent 3 days working on the answer. So when he came back to Vilna, and he went to the Vilna Gaon, he said, I'm very discouraged. Why do I think that I'm special, that I'm doing something important here when two ordinary Jews could get the same answer to my question without being on such a high level? And the Gaon of Vilna said, you brought it into the world. Once you brought it into the world, it was available to them. But you brought it in first.
Had nothing to do with synergy.
Sorry?
It had nothing to do with synergy, that there was two.
No. It's cause. This is one causes the other. So this is a very, very important principle. Martyrdom is brought into world by Isaac's willingness to die. The willingness to suffer losses was brought into the world by Abraham's willingness to suffer the loss of Isaac.
So what's next?
Well,
what's the next thing you think that can be made possible?
Well, I think there are many things. I don't think that can be. I think they are made possible. Sacrificing your position in favor of somebody else. I taught in the university world for 10 years. It would happen that you have a professor and they have a young student or a new young professor who's much smarter, who's a real genius. Do you recognize that? Do you give him priority, or you use academic rules to make sure that he doesn't get? Hillel was a sage in Babylon, and he came up to Israel. Nobody knew him there. Came into the academy and sat there with all the other students. Question was raised, and people tried to answer it, and finally Hillel answered it. That means he did better than the whole academy of Jerusalem scholars. So the head of the yeshiva said, okay, I quit. He's better than I am. Let him take over. That never happened in a university anywhere. In the whole history of universities, that never happened. Saul Kripke was a great genius. In high school, he proved a very fundamental theorem in modal logic. He went to Harvard and got his PhD at Harvard. And the question was, should they appoint him to the faculty at Harvard? But the two grand old men of the faculty there had a different style of philosophy. So they said no. So he went to Princeton, became one of the 20th century's greatest philosophers. But he's not doing our style. We don't want to have him here. It's a different world. So this idea of being willing to give up your position, your reputation, your superiority when somebody else, that's something that goes back. There must have been one Jewish scholar who did it first. I don't know who the first one did it, but it became a chain effect. Bjornson Eibschitz was a Rav in Prague. He was a businessman in Prague. And there was a yeshiva in Prague. And one day the head of the yeshiva said to the students, here's a problem, I want you to think about it. They gave him the problem. They went, no. On the way home, one of them met Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz, who was a businessman. And he said, what did you learn in yeshiva today? He said, I'll tell you, the yeshiva gave us a problem. Tell us to think about it. So Rabbi Yonasan said, what's the problem? A problem? He said, try this answer. Next day, the head of the yeshiva says to the boys, did you think about the problem? One of them raised his hand and said, yeah. I happened to meet Rabbi Yonasan on the street, and I told him the problem, and he gave me this answer. And he says the answer, and the Rosh Yeshiva says, that's a good answer. One of the other boys says, hey, something's funny here. Because I met Rabbi Yonasan also, and I also asked him the question, and he gave me a different solution. So Rosh Yeshiva said, no, what was his solution? And second solution was also a good solution. To make a long story short, every one of the boys have been given a different solution by Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz. And the result of it was that the head of the yeshiva quit. He's obviously a much better scholar than I am. Let him take over the yeshiva. This became, part of the Jewish commitment to peace. Now, Chaim Brisker, who in the 19th century was one of the biggest scholars in all of Europe, he wrote a commentary on Maimonides' Guide, which became standard for high-level learning in all the yeshivas in the world. He was once invited to give a public lecture in a certain area, and all the great scholars of the area gathered to hear him speak. And in the middle of the lecture, he stopped and he said, everything that I have told you is wrong. And he sat down. He realized in the middle of the lecture there was a mistake, right? Did that ever happen to anybody in university? Never, ever. Never, ever, ever, ever did it happen. We had visiting speakers at Hopkins, as every university does, and sometimes someone would read a paper, and one of the students was smart enough would catch him. We'd catch him on something. And you could see it. You could see it. They never said, oh, you're right, I'll have to go back and do it again. They made up phony answers, and they changed the subject, and academia is really not very honest. It really is not very honest. Rabbi Meiselman, whom I quote all the time, he did his undergraduate degree at Harvard, and he did his PhD in mathematics at MIT. He's very smart. Somebody once came and wrote and read a paper in a Jewish subject, famous professor, coming to Harvard. And the paper was about why it is that a Jewish slave is freed in the sabbatical year. Why is freed in the sabbatical year? So Rabbi Meiselman let him get halfway through the paper, and then he raised his hand and said, by the way, where does it say that the Jewish slave is freed in the sabbatical year? I said, well, yeah, it says it. I'm just... Rabbi Meiselman says, where does it say it? Where are the verses? He didn't know. So Rabbi Meiselman said, why don't you look at this verse, and that verse, and that verse. When you look, this is what you see. If you purchase a Jewish slave, he serves you for 6 years, and in the 7th year he goes out. That's the 7th year from the purchase date. It has nothing to do with the sabbatical year at all. The guy just confused something that every 11-year-old who studies Chumash knows. This professor of Jewish thought. So, Rabbi Meiselman pointed out the mistake, and he said, okay, I hear what you're saying, but still, and he went on with his paper as if nothing happened. He didn't say, oh, golly, I made a mistake, it is not relevant anymore. No, he just kept going. Like, anyway, I have lots and lots of examples, and especially in Jewish secular scholarship, there's just no end of examples. I come from a non-religious background. I studied these things. I went through them. If non-religious Jewish scholarship had made sense, that's where I would be today. I wouldn't be here. I had no commitment to be here. I had no particular reason to be here other than when I began to investigate things.
This made the most sense.
It made the most sense. And I did a 2-year investigation before I even drew any preliminary conclusions. And after that, I kept investigating. I kept talking to people, outsiders, who talked to me and gave me all sorts of critiques of what we were doing. Biblical criticism, I went through with great detail, and conflict with science, I went through in great detail. I mean, I wanted to make sure that what I was doing was reasonable.
I think what makes people so angry is that this is the foundation of all the religions. All of them agree that this is true. They just disagree on further things. So.
That's exactly right, and that's a very difficult position for them to be in. And that's why early Christianity and early Islam both made very strenuous efforts to convert Jews, because they say they're fulfilling a book. Here's the group of people who are the custodians of that book, and they say, no. That's not a good position to be in. If you could get the custodians of the book to say, yes, you are really fulfilling this book, that would be a very good foundation. And when the Jews said no, after a while, both the Christians and the Muslims turned against them, because what else could they do?
It'd be interesting to find out, like, trace back specific, like, Christians and Muslims and whatever religion, be able to trace their direct descending of their religion to, like, a crusade or something. Like, hey, your ancestor many years ago converted to Christianity because they were either that or they died. I wonder what they would say to that, and that there is no such thing in Judaism as someone whose family was forced to convert to Judaism.
I'll tell you, it's against Jewish law to do that. There was one period in history where the king did it against what the rabbis told him to do. It did happen during the time of the Maccabean kings. It was short and short-lived. Sorry?
Short but successful?
I don't know how many converts they actually produced. So much so that the Jewish law goes the opposite way. If there's any reason that's pushing a person to convert to Judaism other than his own sincere belief, we won't accept him. So during the times of David and Solomon, the Sanhedrin said, we don't accept any converts. Because they had a magnificent kingdom, because they had wisdom that impressed the whole world, because they had a great economy, because they had peace and prosperity. Then they didn't accept converts, because they were afraid that they were overly impressed with the peace and the prosperity and the wisdom and everything else, and not because they want to serve God. And what happened, I'll just tell you this, I'm going to quit. What happened was there were courts that illegally went through a conversion procedure. Then they said, we'll see if the person remains faithful to Judaism until he dies, then we'll say retroactively that the conversion was valid. But if he changes his mind, we'll say that retroactively the conversion was not
It
valid.
doesn't matter once he's dead. It doesn't matter if it was valid.
No, the other way around. In other words, he'll always have a way to get out of it. If a person goes through a sincere conversion, a real sincere conversion, and changes his mind later,
Who's the judge
then
of that?
he's just. Who's the judge of that? Well, we have very difficult procedures for becoming Jewish, and the purpose of it is to discourage people who aren't sincere.
So the Rosh Hashiva would be, if someone was trying to convert here, the Rosh Hashiva would be the one to say.
No, there's a set of rabbis whose job is to work with applicants for
So
conversion.
we have a set of those rabbis for here, not here, but like that we're affiliated with here.
No, the Israeli government, the rabbinate, has its rabbis for doing that. There are other independent courts that do that, and they have their reputations. We advise people who want to convert, where they should go to have the procedures done by the most reputable place, the place with the best reputation. But the difference is this: if a person goes through a sincere conversion and 5 years later changes his mind, then he's going to be judged just the way a Jew would be if he went off and practiced another religion or did something like that. It would be very severe. With these people, we didn't say that because we say it's very difficult to judge their sincerity at the time of the conversion. If at any time later they decide they want out, they can get out. Because we'll say retroactively that means that the original conversion wasn't sincere and then they never were Jewish. If, however, they live out their whole lives as Jews, then we say then there was no reason to doubt the original conversion, and the original conversion
Is there a specific time frame for that?
well,
Is it 5 years?
no. It only becomes absolute when the person dies. If it could be 25 years. After 25 years, he says, I want out, he can get out.
I see.
Because that means originally it wasn't solid. That's because it was a time of King David and King Solomon when there was a dazzling kingdom. And to be part of that kingdom had its own attraction. It was very difficult to weigh up psychologically where the center of gravity was.
But nowhere on the scale of the conversions of the Christians. and
No.
the Muslims,
No. I'm just saying, if we wouldn't even allow positive conditions to influence a conversion, we're certainly not going to put a sword to a person's neck and say convert or die, because we don't trust that conversion.
So even though they may have gotten drawn in for the wrong reasons, we didn't let them join for the wrong reasons.
That's right. That's right. We did our best to make sure that the reasons had to be right. So the first few times you tell the person, thanks but no thanks. I mean, you treat him with respect but with no friendliness and no acceptance. And then afterwards you have to tell them things, what do you want it says? What do you want to join a downtrodden, persecuted people, people whom others dislike and are discriminated against? Why do you want to, are you a masochist? You're just interested in hurting yourself? And, there's a whole repertoire of things like that.